Good morning, church. If you would, please turn your copies of Scripture to Mark chapter 6. We're going to be verses 30 through 44. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. Then he commanded them to all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning, church. If I haven't got to meet you yet, my name is Travis. I'm a pastor here at Harbor Church. And if you would you please turn to Mark chapter 6 with me? And we're going to be looking at verses 30 through 44. Now, there are several stories about Jesus that are just famous. And when I say stories, I don't mean like mystical fairy tales, but real historical events. And there are these famous stories that are just so linked with Jesus that even our atheistic and non-Christian sort of culture that we live in knows these stories, such as Jesus walking on water, Jesus' crucifixion, his resurrection. And this morning, we're going to be looking at Jesus feeding 5,000 people. In John's recording of this event, when Jesus performed this miracle, it even had such a large impact on the crowd that they attempted to take him and make him king by force. Of course, he didn't let that happen. But this event really needs no introduction. But I wonder this morning, how do you interpret it? I wonder if you see this event and this miracle, how you process it. Because even though I've heard this passage preached before, when I began to study it for my own self and let it have an impact on my own heart, I came away with several new things. And my prayer is this morning the Lord does the same thing for you. Most of us know what it feels like to be tired, to be stretched thin, surrounded by needs we cannot meet. We live in a world that never stops asking for more time, more energy, more answers, while quietly reminding us just how little we actually have to give. That's exactly the moment that Mark brings us into in this passage. A weary group of disciples, a massive weary crowd, a desolate place, and an impossible problem. And right there in the middle of exhaustion and insufficiency steps Jesus. Not as a distant miracle worker, but as a shepherd who sees, knows, and cares, and provides in ways that no one expects. Verses 30 through 32, the scene opens up for us. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves." So the passage opens up with the apostles returning, but what are they returning from? Now, if you remember previously in Mark 6, Jesus sent them out. He gave them this sort of first great commission, and he sent them off 2 by 2. And they were sent off with really like a lean provision and gear, and they were to trust in the Lord's provision and the provision of those who they would share the gospel with, their hospitality. And now, after sharing the gospel and completing this sort of first Great Commission, they are returning. And like your son or your daughter returning home from a friend's house or maybe from an epic day, they show up and they tell Jesus all that they had done and taught about how they were an extension of Jesus' ministry. Just like nowadays, we are an extension of Jesus' ministry now when we share the gospel and do ministry here and now. And the reporting back to Jesus, I think, is a reason why we too, as a church, we should celebrate and share the things that the Lord is doing in our midst. Because when we do so, it reminds us that God is still active and that He is near, that His grace still transforms. He's healing broken marriages. He's pulling people out of addictions. And now, just like when Jesus sent out His people, we looked at that process and how He sent them out. Well, we need to do the same here. We need to look at the process in which He brings them back in, because there are several practical implications for how we do ministry as a church. So, for example, He sent people out 2 by 2, and we talked about how if you want to go fast, go by yourself. But if you want to have a greater impact and go for a longer period of time, go with a friend. Just like when we look at that, we need to look at Him receiving these disciples back. I mean, this is Jesus' process for mentorship and ministry. I don't think we can do any better here. So look at this full ministry cycle. When we compare it also with Mark earlier, sending and Mark when they sent them out. So He teaches them in community, He disciples them, trains them. He then sends them out in fellowship and partnership. He then has them return, and then they report back all that had happened. Now, what we're seeing really is Jesus is evaluating not only what had happened, but also His people, His disciples. He's checking out their spiritual condition, as we're going to see in these next couple of verses. So, too often we fail to do some of these steps. We train, but never send out. We send out, but we never train. We go and do and never evaluate. Might I just mention, I think evaluating and giving feedback is probably one of the hardest things to do in ministry because it requires humility on our part. It requires us to have the attitude that, hey, maybe I could have done something better, or maybe I was wrong in this way and I need to correct it in the future. It requires us really to be able to forgive ourselves. So in Jesus' evaluation, notice what He finds. Verse 31. He says, many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. He observes that they needed rest and renewal. Notice He treats rest as another spiritual discipline. In Jesus' evaluation, He realizes that they needed rest and renewal. As we've seen so far in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus would go off to desolate places. He would take naps. He would spend time with the Lord in prayer. And now here, He's going to have His disciples rest. If Jesus rested, if He has His disciples rest, how much more do we need rest? So if we put this little passage together with the previous passage, with them sending them out, we can glean several things. There is certainly a time for us to get to work. Laziness is not a Christian virtue. At the same time, we should have regular programmed periods of rest in our lives, just as Jesus here is teaching us here in Mark. Being a workaholic is not spiritual. And in fact, it can be sinful depending on the motivation and context. We can quickly make the busyness, the work become an idol. The other thing that we notice here about this rest that they're fixing to do and they're planning on doing through Jesus' direction and leadership is that rest is not just drifting into nothingness. They're not going to go sit and become a blob on a couch. Jesus goes off with them. Their rest meant greater intimacy with Jesus. Our rest should be coupled with worship, being in presence with the Lord. It should be coupled with our spiritual growth by reading God's word and meditating on it. And if you rest without Jesus, let me just suggest that you are just resting like the rest of the world. The assumption here is that this rest is for a specific length of time. It's not permanent. And as we're going to see, they're going to jump back into kingdom work pretty quickly. Well, even while resting, we will see in a second, they are prepared to jump right back into ministry if necessary, if the need arises. See, being a disciple sometimes means that we're never really off doing, especially if you have kids in the home. It might mean saying like, hey, I can help. I got this important phone call, but I can help, but it's going to be after 7 p.m., after game night with my kids. Now, like many of us who try to plan in work, look at what happens next in verse 33. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So Jesus and the 12, they get into the fishing boat. And remember, four of these disciples were fishermen. They owned their own fishing boats. So once again, they're probably getting into one of their own boats. And they're leaving, I believe, Capernaum, which is Jesus' ministry base of operations. And then they are going to go sail out to a desolate place to get away from the crowd so they can rest and they can be with Jesus. Now, because of their proximity to Capernaum, they're still in Jewish territory. Later, Jesus is going to feed 4,000 people later on in Mark, but he's going to be in Gentile territory. So remember that for later. But this feeding of the Jews there, it sort of anticipates him later feeding those Gentiles. It anticipates and shows the universality of the gospel and how the gospel is for all people. But I probably passed over this a little too fast. Notice here, they ran there. These people that saw Jesus and his disciples, they run. Now, some of you probably don't like running, right? You probably have the mindset, the only reason why I'm going to run is if something or someone is chasing me. Well, in Near Eastern culture and Jewish culture, they had the same opinion about running. Adults rarely ran, especially in public. Running implied this loss of composure or social dignity. In Hebrew culture especially, a mature man would not run unless he's compelled by extreme urgency or emotion. Running meant setting aside pride. The act of running could symbolize humility before someone greater. Really, this story reminds me of something that our children would do. My kids are getting older now, but I still have one kid that does like to run, and I'm always telling him, hey, slow down a little bit. But maybe we need to be more like our kids that are overwhelmed by their affection, by their excitement. Maybe we need to be more like these people, willing to be a little less dignified, to allow ourselves to be overcome with excitement and affection to be in the presence of Jesus. I mean, these people were so motivated, so determined to meet and see Jesus and hear him teach and preach. They're willing to run a pretty substantial distance. It makes us ask that same question: are we passionate about spending time with Jesus? Verse 34, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And there are several things going on in this verse. I think we could preach a sermon just alone on this verse, but it says Jesus had compassion on them, and he describes them as sheep without a shepherd. More particularly, he has compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, you've probably heard of Jesus referred to as the Good Shepherd, and it's because of verses just like this one. Jesus explicitly identifies himself as a good shepherd, as the Good Shepherd. John 10:11, I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. See, if you were Jewish and you'd been raised reading your Torah or the Old Testament, you would catch this Old Testament reference here. Jesus is not just borrowing a sentimental or sort of colorful metaphor from the Old Testament. He is claiming fulfillment of a major Old Testament office, one normally reserved for God himself. Psalm 23, verses 1 through 3. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. In Psalm 23, just like we're seeing here in Mark, Yahweh, Jesus, is Israel's true shepherd. He provides, he guides, he protects, he nourishes them. When Jesus claims to be the shepherd, he's taking upon himself a role that's usually associated with Yahweh, with God in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, only God truly knows, protects, saves, rescues his sheep. By saying this, Jesus is assuming this messianic and this divine claim. That divine claim and connection is just fully revealed in this passage. So hold on to this. It's going to continue on here in a second. But notice he says that he has compassion on them. Just take a moment to consider that Jesus has compassion on his sheep. See, some of us, most of us, in Reformed circles, we have a tendency to see Jesus as sort of this stoic God of justice and holiness. What happens is we end up kind of sort of crafting a Jesus who is stoic, sort of uninvolved. Sometimes we have this feeling, right? There's nothing in me or about me that anyone could love, let alone Jesus. What I love about the Gospels, though, is the fact that we're constantly reminded that Jesus is not unattached, or he's not detached or uninvolved or unemotional or even stoic. In the Gospel so far, we've seen in Mark 1, Jesus was moved with pity. In Mark 10, in a little bit, we're going to see that Jesus loved the rich young ruler. In John 11, Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. These are just a couple of references about Jesus' love and compassion and his emotion. John 15:9, as the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. Some of us need to see this here in this verse and remember that God has compassion for you, his sheep, his flock, his people. He loves you. Some of you might be right now trying to qualify that love, trying to give it maybe a little bit of context or color or rules. Don't. You are right. There is nothing in you, nothing in the natural man or woman that merits forgiveness or love. Yet when you were a sinner, when you were an enemy of God, through Christ, God showed his love for you, his compassion for you, his grace for you. Make sure you balance out a biblical view of Jesus and God. Make sure you balance this out. He is justice, he is holiness, he is sovereign. But the Gospels continually remind us that he is love. And we're going to see that love continue to pour out in this passage. It says, and when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. So this is the disciples, and they're talking to Jesus. And this is a very plausible and logical request. They ran all this way. They expended all these calories to get out to there. It's late, and they're going to be hungry, and they're going to need those calories to make it back home. Back then, when it was late, you could just swing by Taco Bell, right, on the way home. They had to basically rely on their own resources. And the disciples tell them what's kind of logical. So Jesus says what's logical. Hey, send them out. Maybe there's a village nearby where they can get some food and some calories. But look at how Jesus responds. He says, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? So Jesus meets sort of their statement, their idea of how to take care of these people. He meets them with this thought-provoking response. You give them something to eat. I believe he's asking them, he's inviting them into the process of this miracle that he's fixing to work. Now, it's assumed, because of verse 44, the last verse, that they have surveyed this group. They saw that there were 5,000 men. Now, that numerical estimate right there, it did not include women and children. So if you were to sort of quantify that and try to figure out how much that was and estimate it, that could be somewhere around 10 to 15,000 people. Now, if it was made up of some large families like here at Harbor, that could be somewhere more around 20,000 people. Then, with almost sort of mild sarcasm, so many words, they say it would cost us 200 denarii to feed all of these people. Now, a single denarii was a day's wages. 200 denarii was equivalent to about 7 to 8 months worth of work. It's quite beyond their means. It's quite beyond the average person's means back then. So their skepticism here shows that they're relying on their own resources, on their own relative strength. And it really highlights human insufficiency. The statement, you give them something to eat, causes them to reflect on their human insufficiency. Now, to further highlight that, verse 38, and he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. So he asked them, how much food do you have on hand? Right about now, the disciples are probably thinking, whoa, Jesus is being serious here. So they do some scrounging, and they come up with only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and this is clearly not enough food, not enough servings, not enough calories to feed possibly 10 to 15,000 people that are there. Now look at what happens in verses 39 and 39 and 40. And these are not just sort of random details that Mark's including here. So look closely. He says, then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and fifties. Now Mark could have omitted these details. He could have omitted the color of grass, but he didn't. What's happening is he's painting this scene that these are like sheep out in this desolate place being taken care of by their shepherd. The details here are just theologically loaded. They're not merely decorative or descriptive, and it calls to mind, again, Psalm 23. He makes me lie down in green pastures. So this phrase, it evokes the fact that Jesus is the great shepherd. He's providing rest, provision, and divine care for these sheep. Jesus is having the sheep come to the greener pastures to be fed by him, having them lie down to rest, having them sit down in groups. He's promoting order, not chaos. A true shepherd directs the flock. He doesn't just merely feel compassion and do nothing about it. He leads and he provides both spiritually earlier and now physically. The crowd does not just self-organize, Jesus organizes him. So that way they can be better nourished with the miracle that he's about to perform. It says, in taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. So Jesus takes what's on hand, 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he looks up into heaven. This is his typical sort of prayer posture towards the Father who is in heaven. He's orienting himself to the Lord in heaven. And in the sister accounts, it has him thanking the Lord for the food and also blessing it. Youth, you might sometimes think, hey, when we pray before dinners, like, where did this come from? Is this just some kind of weird old cultural thing from back in the past that my parents have brought forward? No, we see it in places like here in the Bible. We see it before Jesus does a Lord's Supper with his disciples. We even see in the book of Acts, in Acts 27, Paul, before breaking bread and eating with the crew, even in the midst of a storm, he prays over the food. So when we pray before a meal, we're doing something that is biblical. We're in the pattern of Scripture. We're doing what Jesus did. But let me just draw your attention to these verbs here in this verse. Look closely. It says he took, he blessed, he broke, and he gave. These verbs should remind you of the Lord's Supper. It's almost as if this anticipates the Last Supper. The Lord's Supper is a spiritually nourishing meal where we feast on the good news of the gospel and remember our continued fellowship with Christ and with each other. So he prays, he blesses, he divides, and then in verse 42, everyone eats. Everyone. All 15,000 of them eat, and it says that they were satisfied. Now, that's a miracle in itself. But Jesus is able to create enough food to feed, say, 15,000 people. Enough calories, enough servings, and there are still 12 baskets left over. See, the problem is we often read about this miracle and we interpret it in sort of a wrong way. I've even seen some interesting interpretations of it. I read one guy who thought that this was a Jesus sort of showing socialist tendencies, sort of reading in a political philosophy from the 1700s. But to do that, to turn Jesus here into a socialist Jesus, is to sort of flatten out this story, to flatten out the supernatural miracle that happens. What happens is it turns this miracle into a miracle of sharing. If you do that, it's no longer this divine, supernatural miracle. This is not like kids sharing French fries at Chick-fil-A. To turn Jesus here and its miracle into some type of miracle of sharing is really to push the onus and the focus of this passage to somewhere where it's actually not. See, to do that is sort of also to like put the emphasis on something else. So if we were to read Jesus here as a socialist, we would then put the onus on the government, a third party, to take care of people, where I believe Jesus is calling us to meet the physical and spiritual needs of those around us. It reminds us, if we do that, it also takes away the fact that Jesus can do a lot with a little here. This is not just the power of sharing. It's not a mere miracle of provision or a miracle of hospitality. Mark presents this as a creation miracle, an act which Jesus exercises the same authority as God does, say in Genesis, where he's bringing out abundance out of seemingly nothingness. He's ordering chaos. He's sustaining life by his mere word. See, we think that we are creative, right? That we somehow create things. A lot of times our creation is a whole lot like cooking, right? I take pre-existing matter, materials, ingredients, I slap it together. I boil pasta, I sprinkle some powdered cheese on there, and I have macaroni and cheese. But God, like Jesus here, creates from nothing. No other ingredients. He brings forth. Think about it. Jesus creates, he generates bread that has never been touched by a fire in an oven. He creates fish that have never swam in the sea, were never caught by nets, never roasted over a fire. Fish and bread that are edible, ready to be consumed. This is a creation miracle. He creates, he doesn't just merely divide and distribute. That's why they have 12 baskets later full of food. Jesus does only what God can do. Only what we see God doing in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, prophets would pray, and then God would act. Here, Jesus prays, and then Jesus acts directly. This places Jesus on the creator side of reality, not on the creature side of reality like us. It also places him as the good shepherd. The fact that Jesus teaches them, he orders them, he brings order to the chaos of all the people. He feeds them spiritually and physically. It tells us that Jesus is not a failed shepherd. See, in the Old Testament too, what we'd read about is God constantly calling out the shepherds of Israel, how they were failed shepherds. For example, Ezekiel 34, verses 2 through 3. It says, "All shepherds of Israel who have been feeding yourselves, should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat and you clothe yourselves with wool. You slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep." There are many verses like this one in the Old Testament where God calls out the spiritual leaders of Israel who were not taking care of the sheep and leading them like they were supposed to. In the Gospels, this also plays out where he is having to correct the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees who were failing in this very way. They would exploit the flock, fail to protect, abandon the weak, load them up with heavy legalistic burdens. Whereas Jesus, he loves the sheep. He has compassion on the sheep. He brings order. He brings peace. He spiritually and physically nourishes them, and they are satisfied. He gives them rest with his finished work on the cross. And as we leave here this morning, I believe there are two takeaways that really kind of stand before us that we need to grab a hold of. The first is that our ministries in our homes, at church, at our workplaces, it must flow out of a compassion and a love for people. Verse 34, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus had tried to draw for rest and for renewal with his disciples, yet he sees this crowd and compassion and love interrupts his schedule. Faithful ministry is not driven by strategy, productivity, convenience, some sort of need to be doing and going and being active, but by Christ-like compassion for people who are spiritually and physically in need. If you just lead with just mere strategy or efficiency, without the proper orthodox, right, Christ-like affection, it will lead to cold productivity and cold leadership and cold worship. Imagine going to your kids and saying, "Kids, we're going to do a catechism. We're going to read this chapter out of the book of the Bible because this is what people say I need to do in order to raise kids who are going to be productive members of society and productive members of a church one day." Right? They'd rather play their Xbox because they can see right through that. You have to have this compassion, this love for your kids that Jesus here is showing us. You have to have this love and compassion for your friends at work who you want to disciple. And then that will really lead to some rich, genuine ministry and discipleship and impact in their lives. Our ministries, it must flow from a love for the Lord and for Jesus and for people that we're trying to reach. The last thing I want to leave you with from this passage is in verse 37. He says, "You give them something to eat." Jesus often calls us to give what we know we don't have. When asked to provide the masses with food, the disciples, they correctly assess their insufficiency. We don't have enough here. We have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. We need to be able to accurately look at our own sufficiency in the same way. We need to do the same thing. I only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish here. Jesus frequently calls his people to obedience that exposes their weakness, their insufficiency, so that the dependence is on him. It replaces our self-reliance and our own strength and our own resources. God is not limited by your lack of skill, your lack of knowledge, your lack of talent. He's not. But he is limited and can be limited by your refusal to trust and act and obey. Jesus can do a lot with a little. I'll paraphrase here Sinclair Ferguson. He said, "The Lord often brings us to the end of ourselves so that we may discover the sufficiency of Christ." We don't have all the resources, but God does. So pray, live, act, minister accordingly. We are like the disciples. Oftentimes we are glorified waiters, bringing people the most important meal that they will ever eat.